Alright, everybody, for today's critical thought, we're returning to the topic of incremental versus supplemental content when it comes to game development. But with the added inclusion of talking about what this means for multiplayer. So we basically have supplemental content for this vlog. But nevertheless, being able to understand the kinds of content you can develop for a game is very important for developers wanting to expand, whether it's through games as a service or as something like DLC or an expansion after a game's success. But we'll start with incremental content because it's the easier of the two to explain. Incremental content is any kind of additional work that directly expands the gameplay experience. So if I have a 10-hour game and we put out a DLC that adds 3 more hours, well, now we have a 13-hour game. And this includes any kind of content that will basically add to the time spent playing the game. Be it a new story mission, new levels, anything that will again just directly impact how long someone is playing it for. Now, because of that, incremental content works best in linear titles or a game that has a fixed start and end point. Be it a single-player action game or even a MMO that has a fixed amount of content or a level cap. And with that kind of incremental content, the advantage is that it's very explicit in terms of the value it provides to the consumer. Again, if I say that we have a 30-hour long game and I give you 10 more hours of content, you can see very easily what your money is paying for. The same goes for episodic games. With each episode being split into these little chunks, you can again see, okay, I have this season, so I'm paying for episodes 1, 2, 3, and so on. And again, each episode grows a story and may add more gameplay, and so on and so on. When it comes to MMOs, you can really see this with how much a game can grow and change thanks to these expansions. When World of Warcraft launched, I guess that was like 50,000 years ago at this point, I believe the level cap was at either 60 or 70. Again, I did not spend too long playing Vanilla WoW, so I'm sure some of you out there will be able to correct me on that one. But with the number of expansions that Blizzard released, they kept raising the level cap, or keep on adding foundations to the game. And that's what incremental content does. It keeps growing and expanding the game. With that said, though, there are a few risks and considerations you have to understand. The first is that it can be very hard to maintain incremental content over a long period of time. Because again, you are constantly adding to the foundation of your game, which means that a game at the start or at retail is going to be a different experience 6 months, a year, 2 years, whatever down the line. And you can run into some very weird situations in terms of quality control where you'll have expansions that if the base game was like rated at this level, one expansion makes it go up, another one makes it go down, maybe one is just slightly better, and can lead to this very weird situation of certain expansions being worth it or DLC, while others you should just skip. With Borderlands 2, for instance, I remember with the Season Pass, there was certainly room for argument over which DLCs were the ones you had to have. I think like stuff like the Hammerlock one wasn't reviewed as highly compared to Tiny Tina. But that's the big point. When you are working on incremental content like this, you are only as good as your previous expansion. And this can lead into burnout when you're just trying to constantly one-up yourself with each and every piece of content. In DC Universe's online case, they couldn't do that. And I still use them as an example for this. When it was like, I think a month or two before the game went live, I think like the director said, with our team, we are going to be able to put out expansion level content once a month, and it will be consistent. And they did it for 1 month, and then they just completely fell apart. But that's the point. Because you are directly adding to this game, you are basically trying to feed an endless or a beast that can never be sated. Because as we all know, gamers will consume content much, much faster than you can put it out. And woe be it to the developer who releases a game with the majority of their content missing and hoping to add it back in before people get to the end. But again, when it comes to incremental content, it can directly impact how the game is played, and it really allows you to see the developer is doing work on that front. Now, when it comes to multiplayer, we can get into a little bit of a debate on this part. But for me, multiplayer content, when it's incremental, would be stuff like new maps, new game modes. Again, anything that adds to the number of hours you can spend playing a game. Now, again, when it comes to new characters or classes, that is a bit of a debate, and I'm sure we'll have some discussions in the comments below about it. But let's move on to the really tricky one, and that's supplemental content. Supplemental content is anything that enhances or refines what's in the game without directly adding to it. And that, I know, is not an easy explanation, but here's an analogy I came up with. Incremental content is akin to adding to your home, putting in a new room, a new floor, adding a new garage, anything like that that fundamentally changes what the foundation was after this work was done. So again, a house that is only one floor high, you get a second floor, you now have a two-story home. Supplemental content is about taking what's there and refining it. So let's say you get your house painted, kitchen remodel, replace all your appliances, new carpeting, new wiring, anything like that. That kind of work, it is adding to your home, but it's not something that directly impacts the foundation. It's making what you already have better. And that's what supplemental content is in a nutshell. It is the work of refining systems of your game or adding to the back end to make what's already there a much more enjoyable experience. Because of that, supplemental content works better with games that are meant to be replayed. So, roguelikes, games with procedural or randomly generated content, something that you're expecting someone to replay this game again and again and again. And this is why supplemental content doesn't work all that well for linear experiences. Because if we take a 60 to 80 hour RPG and we say, well, guess what? We're going to add in a new costume and 5 new weapons. How many people would replay 80 hours of gameplay just for those improvements, with everything else staying exactly the same? Now, when it comes to supplemental content, again, the spectrum is very wide in terms of what we can talk about. On one end, we can say hats, new costumes, color palettes, anything like that. On the other end, we can say stuff like brand new game systems, completely changing how progression works in your game. New enemy types that can pop up during a run. Again, it's stuff that's not directly adding to the amount of time spent playing the game, but making that time spent playing a lot more interesting and enjoyable. And when it comes to the idea of games as a service, supplemental content really does fit along these lines. Going back to multiplayer, we can talk about adding in new character classes, new weapons, even adding stuff like a prestige mode, or changing how the underlying systems work. And there are 2 really big examples of this. Payday 2, as we've talked about before, has had fundamental changes to its foundation over the now, I think we are now officially over 3 years of the game being on the market. They've gone over the skill systems. They've added in a new form of progression. They've changed the previous form of progression. They've added in gameplay in the form of vehicle driving and new weapon mods and stuff along those lines that, again, fundamentally change how you play the game without changing the overall scope. And then, keeping with Payday 2, the new heists would be examples of incremental content. Now, another example of a game with that kind of supplemental growth would be something like Overwatch. Over the last, I think it's been about a year since the game's been out, there have, of course, been new champions. But beyond that, Blizzard has, of course, radically changed how previous, or I'm sorry, not champions, heroes, I'm thinking of League of Legends, but they've also changed how the heroes have played. Bastion's been altered. I think Mercy has or is about to get a major update, Symmetrica, and so on. So these are cases where these characters have been fundamentally altered from the beginning of the game. And this is where supplemental content becomes very tricky to understand. Because the first issue is trying to understand how to add it to your title. With incremental content, again, you're saying, here's my game, what can we add to it to grow it? With supplemental content, you're basically saying, this is my game, it's all done, we've completely finished it. Now, how do we take what's there and make it even better? Or even fix something that we thought was good in the first place? And it's very hard to think like that. Because again, for a lot of game developers, once you've ran through an idea, that's your baby. So supplemental content is akin to basically throwing the baby out and starting over again. And it is very tricky to get right. And like I said, not a lot of games in the grand spectrum of things can work with supplemental content. But the ones that do work, it works incredibly well. So some examples would be renowned explorers adding in the idea of campfire stories. Payday 2 again with the inclusion of new progression modes. And of course the big example very recently, XCOM 2 War of the Chosen. Now for longtime fans of Game Wisdom, you know how much I loved XCOM Enemy Within. I thought that was one of the best expansions I have ever seen to a video game. And that is a point-on-point example of supplemental content. What Firaxis did, they didn't say, we're going to add in 10 required missions to XCOM. We're not going to take a 40-hour campaign and turn it into a 80-hour campaign. Instead, what they did was basically refine and grew what was going to happen in those 40 hours. So you had the meld update, which allowed you to augment your squaddies and go with mech suits. You had the second humanoid faction who could attack you and go on missions. You had new items, new aliens, new maps. Again, this kind of content, it's not directly adding to the game experience in the form of making it bigger, like in terms of time, but it's taking what's there and making it better. And War of the Chosen for XCOM 2, again, is a perfect example of that. You have the new classes, new Chosen, new weapons and gear, new mission types, and we could spend another 20 minutes here. I could start just talking about how much I love War of the Chosen. But again, the point is, with War of the Chosen, it's not explicitly adding to that game. Again, in the form of saying this game is now 50 hours long or 70 hours long. And because of that, that's one of the little bit of the risks and considerations of supplemental content, is that it's harder to show your work. If I went to a friend and said, you have to buy this DLC, it makes this game 15 hours longer and it's going to be great, someone easily understands that. But if I go up to someone and say, hey, you gotta buy this DLC for the stealth game, it completely reworks how stealth detection works. They're going to look at you and go, okay, why should I get that if I already enjoyed the base game? Again, when it comes to incremental content, there is a fundamental difference between retail or vanilla and where we're at with this expansion work. But with that said, one other major risk of supplemental content is because you are inherently changing the foundation or the underlying DNA of your game, there is the risk of you making things worse. And that is the dark side of supplemental content. If your game is already amazing and you decide to gut it and redo all the systems, what happens if you make your game worse? What if people hate the changes that you did to your game? You can't exactly, roll back supplemental content like that. And Payday 2 has certainly ran into some controversy with that, of course, with the inclusion of the microtransactions for the original save system. And I'm trying to think of some other really big name examples, and they're not coming to me right now. But for those of you watching this, can you think of examples of games that have fundamentally been made worse by the fan base because of supplemental content? The only one that I can think of that may or may not be a case is Team Fortress 2. Team Fortress 2 is a textbook example of what supplemental content can do to a game. Vanilla Team Fortress 2 and Team Fortress 2 today are completely different experiences and gameplay. And for some people, I know some of my friends have said this, they found the changes to Team Fortress 2 with the inclusion of items and the overall wackiness that was kind of added over time kind of turned them off from that experience. But again, when it comes to supplemental content, it's one of those things that once you've gone through with it, you have to see it through to the end. You can't release supplemental content, whether it's in the form of a paid DLC or as a games as a service, you are directly just changing the game for free, and then decide 2 weeks later, we made a mistake, let's take it all back. It really looks bad on a developer when that happens. But with that said, we're going to wrap up today's critical thought here. Again, when it comes to the kinds of content you can develop for your game, it is basically going to be either incremental or supplemental. And again, incremental content is better for games that have fixed endpoints or fixed chunks of content, while supplemental works better for games that are meant to be replayed. Because again, when it comes to supplemental content, you are taking what you have and refining it and making it better. And while that isn't as easy to represent compared to incremental content, it can do a lot to make a great game even better. And again, I've said this before, but XCOM Enemy Unknown came really close to being one of my all-time favorite games with Enemy Within. And chances are, if I can play more War of the Chosen, I may be saying the same thing for that as well. But to wrap things up for today, my final question for you, and I'm going to throw it to either consumers and one for developers. For consumers, can you think of games that you've played that were fundamentally made better thanks to supplemental content? For the developers watching this, have you had to make that decision between incremental and supplemental content for your game? And how did you decide that? And for your own design sensibilities or your design philosophy, what do you see yourself preferring to work on for either a game that you are currently developing or has been released, or one that you're planning on working on in the future? So let me know in the comments below, but thank you so much for watching. If you're new, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Check back for daily discussions on game design here and on GameWisdom.com, where we examine the art and science of games. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and come back nightly around 10 Eastern for regular game streams. For a collection of my writings as well as weekly podcasts on game design topics, be sure to check out game-wisdom.com. You can follow me on Twitter at GWBycer for updates from me throughout the day. And be sure to check out our Patreon campaign. You can find us on Patreon under GWBycer for ways to not only support Game Wisdom, but you can get access to our Discord channel where we'll talk game design topics, as well as allow you to vote for our Saturday night grab bag stream. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoy the next video here on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel.